In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the world was faced with an economic and logistical conundrum of staggering proportions. The war had propelled the global economy into a period of unparalleled production and technological advancement, but now, as hostilities ceased, those same industries, factories, and machines that had driven wartime economies were rendered obsolete. The cessation of active conflict left the world with an enormous surplus of military equipment, vehicles, ships, aircraft, and weapons that no longer had any immediate purpose. For many nations, the focus shifted from military expansion to rebuilding war-torn economies, and the question became what to do with the vast quantities of machinery that had been built in haste and desperation. By 1945, the United States alone had produced over 300,000 tanks and nearly 300,000 aircraft, alongside millions of smaller pieces of equipment. Most of these machines had been conceived for battle, their design, function, and purpose tightly bound to a wartime economy. The war had seen an unprecedented acceleration of industrial production, but now that the fighting was over, the economic imperative was to rein in production and repurpose national resources for civilian life. The result was a swift and widespread reassessment of the machines that had fueled the war. In Europe, the situation was even more dire. Cities lay in ruins, and the infrastructure of entire nations had been shattered. The Allies' victory had come at an extraordinary cost, one that demanded the immediate prioritization of civilian needs. For Germany, the nation that had been at the forefront of military technology and production, this was particularly pronounced. The country's factories, once the beating heart of Nazi war machinery, were left in ruins. The need for reconstruction was so great that the machines once designed for war were now considered liabilities rather than assets. At the same time, the Soviet Union, with its vast stockpiles of weaponry and heavy machinery, faced its own dilemma. The Soviet war effort had been among the most massive and resource-draining in history, and with the war's end, the USSR found itself confronted with an immense surplus of military equipment that had no use in the new political reality. For the Soviet leadership, the focus quickly shifted from war production to managing the occupation of Eastern Europe and rebuilding a shattered economy. The machines of war were no longer assets but burdens. In the United Kingdom, a similar process of demobilization took place. The British economy had been heavily strained by the war, and the government was facing a severe shortage of funds. The question of what to do with the enormous quantities of military equipment, particularly tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels, was pressing. Many of these machines, though still operational, were rapidly becoming obsolete. The introduction of newer technologies, such as jet engines and more efficient vehicles, meant that much of the wartime machinery was outpaced by the demands of the post-war world. The problem of surplus machinery did not only concern military vehicles but extended to the entire industrial base that had been repurposed for the war effort. Entire factories that had once produced civilian goods were now dedicated to the manufacture of armaments. The conversion back to peacetime production was not instantaneous, and in many cases, factories stood empty or were repurposed for new purposes. The machines that had produced tanks and bombs now had to be retooled to produce cars, refrigerators, and radios. In the United States, the conversion of wartime factories back to civilian production was one of the largest economic shifts in history, but it came with its own set of challenges. The vast networks of factories and supply chains that had been forged during the war now faced the question of how to transition to a peacetime economy. In many cases, machines that had been used to produce war materials were simply abandoned or scrapped. Factories were closed, and machinery was either sold off, disassembled, or left to rust. In some instances, entire production lines were bulldozed to make way for new, more efficient manufacturing systems. In others, surplus materials were simply discarded. The process was slow, and it was complicated by the need to manage enormous amounts of equipment and machinery that had once been essential to the war effort but were now considered an economic liability. By the end of 1945, the issue of surplus military machinery was becoming a pressing concern for governments around the world. The sheer scale of wartime production meant that there was no easy way to dispose of the vast quantities of military equipment that had been produced. For the United States, It was a matter of finding storage or disposal solutions for the millions of tons of surplus goods that were no longer needed. In many cases, the machinery that had been so carefully designed and constructed for the war effort was simply abandoned in vast warehouses or on military bases. For the United Kingdom, the issue was even more complicated. The government had limited funds to devote to the disposal of surplus equipment, and with much of the country's infrastructure still in disrepair, there was little capacity to repurpose military factories. As a result, much of the wartime machinery was simply scrapped or left to deteriorate in depots. In Germany, the situation was even more dire. The war had left the country devastated, and the post-war government had little capacity to address the surplus of military equipment. The machines that had powered the Nazi war economy were left in warehouses and factories across the country, with little hope of finding new uses for them. The Allies, now in control of Germany, were focused on dismantling the Nazi military machine and ensuring that the remnants of the war effort were thoroughly destroyed. This meant that vast quantities of military equipment were either abandoned, destroyed, or left to rot in the ruins of the war. For the Soviet Union, the situation was slightly different. While the USSR had an enormous surplus of military equipment, much of it was simply stored in vast depots, never to be used again. The Soviet government, focused on its own post-war reconstruction efforts, had little interest in preserving or repurposing much of this machinery. Instead, it was stored away, sometimes to be disassembled for parts or sold to other nations. The machines of war, once symbols of Soviet power, were now seen as remnants of a bygone era. Even in countries with more robust economies, the problem of surplus military equipment was not easily solved. The question of what to do with the machines that had powered the wartime economies of the world was one that lingered for years after the war had ended. In many cases, these machines were either abandoned or scrapped, often in the most unspectacular and forgettable of ways. As the world moved into the post-war period, the machinery that had once been central to the global economy was quietly disposed of, its significance fading into history. By the late 1940s, the world had turned its focus to the economic and political challenges of rebuilding. The wartime economy had created massive surpluses of machinery and equipment, but the post-war world had no use for them. The machines that had powered the war effort were now an inconvenience, and in many cases, their fate was left to the vagaries of time. Some were sold to other nations, some were repurposed for civilian purposes, but the majority were simply abandoned or scrapped. This was a global phenomenon. In the United States, Europe, the Soviet Union, and even Japan, the post-war world was forced to reckon with the enormous legacy of wartime production. The machines that had defined the war economy were now surplus, obsolete, or unnecessary, and their fate was a story of waste, neglect, and quiet destruction. As governments turned their attention to rebuilding their nations and repurposing their economies, the machines that had powered the war effort were left behind, gradually fading from memory. The fate of these machines was a reflection of the larger shift in global priorities. The machinery of war, once central to the economy, was now a reminder of a period that had come to an end. What had been designed to destroy was now a liability. As countries turned their focus to the future, the machines of the past were quietly erased from history, their purpose and significance lost in the rubble of the war. As the years passed, the fate of the machinery that had powered the wartime economy unfolded along a variety of paths, shaped by economic pressures, geopolitical interests, and the changing priorities of the post-war world. While much of the surplus machinery was scrapped, abandoned, or left to deteriorate in warehouses, there were notable exceptions, particularly when it came to how various countries approached the disposal and repurposing of their wartime assets. In the United States, the enormous post-war surplus posed a unique set of challenges. By the late 1940s, the United States had emerged from World War II as the world's preeminent industrial and economic power. The sheer volume of wartime production meant that millions of tons of military equipment, from aircraft and tanks to ships and artillery, had to be dealt with. For many of these machines, their utility in peacetime was limited. The Pentagon's initial approach was to mothball vast quantities of equipment in strategic reserves, maintaining it in storage for possible future conflicts. This was especially true for tanks and aircraft, many of which had been built to last but were now outclassed by newer technologies. But storing massive quantities of military machines was neither efficient nor cost-effective. By the 1950s, much of this stockpile had begun to rot, or its parts had become obsolete. The United States Army found that large amounts of military vehicles and equipment had not been properly maintained, leading to a significant loss in value. The cost of maintenance was high, and in a peacetime economy, the resources devoted to keeping obsolete machines in working order simply couldn't be justified. The Department of Defense gradually shifted its focus to the development of newer, more advanced technologies, such as the M48 Patton tank and the F-86 Sabre jet, leaving much of the older equipment to languish in storage depots across the country. In some cases, surplus military equipment was sold off or transferred to other nations, often as part of foreign aid programs or strategic alliances. For example, during the Cold War, large quantities of U.S. military equipment, including tanks, trucks, and aircraft, were sent to allied nations, especially in the context of the Marshall Plan and NATO. Some of these machines were used for training purposes, while others were put into active service by allied forces. However, this was not a universal solution. Many countries that received this surplus equipment were unable to fully utilize or maintain it, especially if it was technologically outdated or incompatible with their existing equipment. This left many machines sitting idle or being sold for scrap, a stark contrast to their wartime roles. In the United Kingdom, the post-war situation was similar. The British government was burdened by immense debt from financing its wartime efforts, and its ability to sustain a large military was limited. The problem of surplus machinery, particularly aircraft and tanks, was compounded by the need to rebuild a country devastated by years of conflict. The Ministry of Supply was tasked with overseeing the disposal of these wartime assets, but the process was slow and haphazard. For example, the British Army found itself with large quantities of obsolete tanks, many of which were still operational but no longer fit for modern warfare. These tanks, while valuable during the war, were soon deemed inefficient and costly to maintain in peacetime. The British government's response was a combination of scrapping, selling, and repurposing military vehicles. Some of the surplus tanks were melted down for scrap metal, while others were sold to countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The Royal Navy also faced a similar dilemma with its fleet of warships. Several large battleships and aircraft carriers, many of which had been at the heart of Britain's naval might during the war, were decommissioned and sold for scrap. These ships, once symbols of British imperial power, were disassembled and recycled, their steel and components repurposed for civilian use. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had its own strategy for dealing with surplus military machines. The USSR had mass-produced tanks, aircraft, and artillery during the war, and by the time peace came, it was left with an enormous surplus of equipment. While some of this military machinery was preserved in strategic storage, much of it was discarded or sent for disassembly. The Soviet government, keen to maintain a military advantage over the West, chose to focus its resources on developing new technologies and modernizing its forces. Older equipment was often cannibalized for spare parts, and large quantities of tanks and artillery were left in remote depots across the country. In some cases, the Soviet Union also sold surplus equipment to other socialist nations, particularly in Eastern Europe. However, this was often a short-term solution, and many of the tanks and aircraft that left Soviet depots were quickly rendered obsolete by more advanced models. The sheer scale of Soviet wartime production meant that the question of what to do with all of these machines remained unresolved for many years. By the early 1950s, as the Cold War deepened, the USSR turned its focus toward new arms programs, and the machines of the past were quietly forgotten, left to rust in storage yards or dismantled for scrap. Germany's approach to the disposal of surplus military equipment was unique, given the country's post-war occupation and the dismantling of the Nazi military machine. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allies seized control of Germany's military factories and equipment. Many of the machines that had powered the Nazi war machine were dismantled, and large quantities of tanks, aircraft, and artillery were destroyed as part of the effort to ensure that Nazi military power could never be rebuilt. In the years that followed, the Allies also encouraged the destruction of military equipment to prevent any resurgence of German militarism. However, some equipment was preserved for historical reasons, or, in some cases, to be used in the rebuilding of West Germany's military in the 1950s. Tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft from the war were either scrapped or sold to other nations, including some that had once been enemies of Germany. Ironically, some of the German military machines, including their advanced tanks and jets, were purchased by Cold War adversaries who saw value in the technology, even if they had fought against it during the war. In Japan, the disposal of wartime machinery followed a similar trajectory. After the defeat of the Imperial Army, Japan faced a complete dismantling of its military infrastructure. The country's factories, once dedicated to the production of warplanes, ships, and tanks, were converted to civilian use, while much of the military equipment was scrapped or stored. The Japanese government, under the direction of the occupying U.S. forces, began the long process of rebuilding its economy, which required retooling much of the wartime industrial base. Some surplus machinery was sold for scrap, while a small portion was kept for historical preservation.